She posted, "Privacy is important in relationships while hiding conversations from me." I replied by respecting that privacy completely, by removing myself from her life without explanation. "You're being paranoid." That's what she said. Not with anger, not with frustration, with this calm, almost clinical dismissal, like I was a child who had misread a word on a page and needed gentle correction. And I remember standing there in the kitchen, holding a mug of coffee that had already gone cold, nodding slowly. Not because I believed her, but because some part of me desperately wanted to. I didn't know it then, but that nod, that single, quiet, cowardly nod, was the last time I would ever give Amber the benefit of the doubt. Everything I had built with her over 2 years was sitting on a foundation I hadn't examined closely enough. The apartment we shared, the trips we'd planned for the following summer, the way she'd started signing birthday cards to my mother, the future that felt, not assumed, but decided. And all of it was quietly, invisibly cracking. I just hadn't looked down yet. I didn't realize it then, but that moment in the kitchen changed everything. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. I was 28. She was 26. We'd been together for 2 years and 3 months. Not that I was counting, but she always made a point of anniversaries, so the number stuck. We lived in a mid-sized city, nothing remarkable about it. Shared a 1-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor of a building that had a broken elevator more often than not. That's enough context. The rest of the story will explain itself. It started with a phone, not in a dramatic, movie scene kind of way. More like the way a slow leak starts. Not a flood, just a quiet drip that you keep telling yourself you'll deal with later. Amber had always been attached to her phone. That wasn't new. A lot of people are. But somewhere around month 19 of our relationship, I started noticing something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't that she used her phone more. It was the way she used it. The slight angle adjustment whenever I sat beside her on the couch. The screen that went dark a half-second faster than it used to. The way she'd respond to a notification with this tiny flicker of something across her face. Not happiness exactly, more like alertness, and then deliberately put the phone face down before saying anything to me. Small things. Individually, nothing. Collectively, a pattern I kept choosing not to see. And I kept choosing not to see it because Amber was, on the surface, a good partner. She was attentive. She remembered the details. She showed up when I needed her to. She cooked on Sundays and argued passionately about things that mattered and laughed at exactly the right moments in movies. She was the kind of person who made you feel, genuinely, like you had chosen well. Which is probably why I was so slow to trust what I was seeing. The first real signal came on a Tuesday. I remember because I'd had a particularly rough day at work. One of those grinding, low-grade awful days where nothing catastrophically goes wrong, but everything feels slightly off. And I came home earlier than expected. She didn't hear me come in. The apartment had this cheap, hollow front door that creaked on the hinge, but that day it didn't. And I walked in quietly, and she was on the couch, legs tucked up, typing something rapidly with both thumbs, smiling at the screen. Not a small smile. A real one. The kind that reaches the eyes. The kind you can't manufacture. I said, "Hey." She startled, visibly startled, and the phone went to her chest in one fast motion. Then she looked up, saw it was me, and the expression rearranged itself. "You're home early," she said, and her voice was perfectly normal. But her hand was still pressed against the phone like something needed protecting. "Yeah," I said. "Bad day." She got up, kissed me on the cheek, asked if I wanted tea. The moment dissolved. I told myself it was nothing, but I didn't sleep well that night. I want to be honest about something before I go further. I'm not a jealous person by nature. I've never been the guy who checks his partner's messages or needs to know where she is at every hour. I genuinely believe people in relationships are still individuals. Separate lives, separate friendships, separate interior worlds. All of that can exist inside a committed relationship. I believe that. I still do. So I want to be clear. What was bothering me wasn't that Amber had conversations I wasn't part of. It was the hiding. The deliberate, practiced hiding. The way it had become so natural, so fluid, that she didn't even pause anymore. It was automatic, like muscle memory built over weeks or months of repetition. That's what I couldn't let go of. I didn't say anything for almost 2 weeks after the Tuesday incident. I watched instead. Not obsessively. Not like I was conducting surveillance. Just paying attention in a way I probably should have been doing all along. And what I noticed was this. Amber was never fully present anymore. Even when she was right next to me. Even when we were having a normal conversation, laughing at something, watching a show we both liked. There was this thin, translucent wall between her and me, like she was managing two separate realities at once. And at some point during those 2 weeks, she started staying up after I went to bed. Not every night, but enough nights that it started to feel like a pattern. I'd wake up at 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. and reach across to her side of the bed and find it empty. I'd hear the faint, soft tapping of her keyboard or the low backlight glow leaking under the bedroom door. And in the morning, she'd be back, asleep beside me, phone on her nightstand screen down. I didn't ask about it. Not yet. The post happened on a Friday. I was scrolling through my feed. Mindless. The kind of scrolling you do not because you're actually interested, but because your thumbs need something to do. And there it was. A quote graphic. Black background. White text. Clean font. She'd shared it to her story. It read, "Privacy is important in every relationship. You don't owe anyone access to every part of your life. Boundaries exist for a reason." And below it, in her own words, she typed, "This. 100 times this." I stared at it for a long moment. There was nothing technically wrong with what she'd posted. Privacy is real. Boundaries are real. I believe in both of those things. But here's what sat wrong with me. Quietly, like a splinter you can feel but can't find. She hadn't posted about privacy before. Not like this. Not with this particular kind of emphasis, this particular kind of energy, the kind that feels less like a general belief and more like a response to something. Like it was directed. Like it was aimed. I put my phone down and stared at the ceiling for a while. Then I picked it back up and liked the post. Because what else do you do? That weekend, we had dinner with a couple of friends, Owen and his girlfriend Cassie. Good people. The easy kind of social interaction where nobody's performing and you can actually just sit and eat and talk. Midway through dinner, Owen made some joke about how Cassie's phone was practically surgically attached to her hand, and Cassie laughed and threw a napkin at him, and everybody laughed. And then Amber said, very casually, "Honestly, I think people in relationships are too obsessed with each other's phones. It's just a phone." Nobody reacted strongly to that. It was a throwaway comment in the middle of a normal dinner. But I heard it differently than I think Owen and Cassie did. I heard it as context, as framing. I glanced at her and she was already reaching for her wine glass, easy and relaxed, like she'd just said something completely neutral. Maybe she had. Maybe I was reading everything wrong. But I kept thinking about it on the drive home, and I didn't bring it up, and she hummed along to the radio, and we went home and went to bed, and at 12:48 a.m. she got up and went to the living room. I lay there in the dark, and for the first time, I let myself think the word I'd been avoiding. I should probably tell you about Marcus. Not because I knew who Marcus was then, but because you're going to need to know who he is later, and I want to make sure you understand that when his name eventually entered my life, it didn't come with a dramatic reveal. It came quietly, casually, the way the most important things usually do. Marcus was someone Amber had known from before we met. An old acquaintance. That was how she'd described him once, briefly, when his name had come up in some peripheral, forgettable way during our first year together. Old acquaintance. Not a close friend. Not someone significant. Just a name that existed somewhere in the background of her life before me. I had no reason to think about him, so I didn't. A few days after the dinner with Owen and Cassie, I had a conversation with Amber that I want to reconstruct as accurately as I can, because the words matter. We were in the kitchen. It was always the kitchen, somehow, and I was washing dishes and she was drying them, and I said, without turning to look at her, "Can I ask you something?" She said, "Sure." I said, "Is everything okay with us?" She paused. Not long. Maybe 2 seconds. Then she said, "Why would you ask that?" And I said, "I don't know. Things feel a little different lately." She set down the dish she was drying and leaned against the counter and looked at me with this expression of gentle concern that was almost convincing. "Different how?" she asked. And I tried to explain. I tried to articulate the phone screen that always turned over, the late nights, the sense of a wall, the post, the comment at dinner. And as I said these things out loud, I could hear how they sounded. Small, circumstantial, like puzzle pieces that didn't quite form a picture. She listened to all of it. And then she said quietly, "You're being paranoid." Not unkindly. With this measured, careful patience that almost made me feel sorry for bringing it up. "I just needed some time to decompress lately," she said. "Work has been a lot. I didn't realize I was making you feel that way. I'm sorry." And she reached out and put her hand on my arm. And I stood there with soapy water dripping off my hands. And I nodded. That nod I told you about at the beginning. The last one I ever gave her. She apologized, and for about a week, things did actually feel better. She put her phone away more. She came to bed when I did. She was present in that tangible, warm way she used to be during our first year. And I relaxed. I exhaled. I told myself I'd been constructing a problem out of shadows. I told myself that being in a relationship long enough means learning to manage your own insecurities, and this had been mine. I actually felt a little embarrassed about the conversation. Then I found the charger. This sounds mundane. It was, in fact, the most mundane possible thing. But I need to tell you how it happened. I was looking for my own phone charger. I'd misplaced it, which I do constantly, and I was checking the usual spots: the nightstand, behind the couch cushions, the kitchen counter. I checked Amber's side of the nightstand. She wasn't home. I wasn't snooping. I just wanted my charger. And I found hers, but tangled with it was a second cable, plugged into a small power bank, attached to a phone I did not recognize. Not her usual phone. A second phone. Older model. Cheap prepaid look to it. Dark screen. I picked it up. I turned it over in my hands. And then I set it down exactly where I found it. And I sat on the edge of the bed. And I sat there for a very long time. I want to be careful here about what I did and didn't do next. I did not unlock the phone. I don't know her passcode for her regular phone, and I had no idea what this one's was. And honestly, the thought of trying to get into it made me feel sick in a way I couldn't quite explain. Not because I was afraid of what I'd find, because of what it would mean that I was looking. So I didn't. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it, and I went to the living room. And I sat there, and I thought about the word I'd been avoiding. And I let myself say it, finally, in the quiet of my own head. Not out loud, but clearly, definitely. She came home an hour later. She was in a good mood. She'd picked up groceries, made a joke about the line at the checkout, poured herself a glass of water. I watched her from the couch, and I thought, how long? Not in an accusatory way, more like a mathematical problem I was trying to solve. How long had this been happening? How many of the moments I'd read as normal were actually something else? How many of the nights I'd thought she was just staying up to decompress had actually been conversations on a phone I'd never seen? How many times had she looked at me across a room and felt, what? Guilt? Nothing. Something I didn't have a word for? She sat beside me on the couch and put her head on my shoulder. Good day, she asked. Pretty good, I said, and we sat there together in the quiet, and I didn't say a word. I want to tell you about the 2 days that followed, because they matter. Because during those 2 days I made the decision. Not impulsively, not out of anger. Slowly, deliberately. The way you make a decision when you've already exhausted every alternative and what's left isn't a choice anymore. It's just an acknowledgement of reality. The first day, I called Owen. Not to tell him everything. Just to talk to someone who knew me well enough to hear what I wasn't saying. We met for coffee. He asked me what was going on. I said, I think I've been ignoring something for a while. He looked at me over his cup and said, how long's a while? I said, probably longer than I want to admit. He didn't push. He just said, what do you want to do about it? And I realized, sitting there, that I didn't want to fight. I didn't want a confrontation. I didn't want a tearful scene where she cried and explained, and I had to decide whether to believe the explanation. Because here's the thing I understood in that coffee shop, in that quiet, ordinary moment. It didn't matter what the explanation was. The second phone existed. The hiding existed. The wall existed. The post existed. The careful, practiced mechanics of concealment existed. And even if she gave me an explanation I could technically believe, I could never unknow any of that. I could never unfeel the weight of a 2-year relationship sitting on a foundation I hadn't been allowed to fully see. Some people say trust is hard to build. That's true. But what they don't tell you is that once it's gone, the space it leaves isn't grief exactly. It's more like silence. A room with all the furniture removed. You can live in it, but it doesn't feel like home anymore. Owen drove me back to the apartment building and said, whatever you decide, you're going to be okay. I believed him. The second day, I figured out the logistics. Owen had a spare room. He offered without me having to ask. He read the situation clearly enough. I had enough in savings to handle the immediate practical fallout. The apartment lease had both our names on it, but the renewal wasn't for another 4 months, so there was time to figure that out properly. I kept a lot of my things at work and at my parents' place from when I'd last visited. Nothing I'd need immediately. I packed one bag. Clothes, laptop, a few things that mattered. I did it while she was at work. I was quiet about it. I was careful. I cleaned up after myself. I left the kitchen the way she liked it. I took my charger, which I found, eventually, behind the microwave. And then I sat at the kitchen table for a few minutes. And I thought about writing a note. I thought about what I would say in it. I thought about every version of the explanation I could offer. The phone, the hiding, the post, the 2 years, the nod in the kitchen. And I realized that whatever I wrote would be an invitation. An invitation for her to respond, to explain, to turn this into a negotiation about what the truth actually was. And I didn't want that. She had posted, publicly, that privacy was important in relationships, that you didn't know anyone access to every part of your life, that boundaries exist for a reason. She was right. She was absolutely right. And I decided to honor that completely. Her privacy was hers. She could keep every part of it. I took my bag. I locked the door behind me with my key. I dropped the key in the mailbox slot on my way out of the building. And I walked to my car. And I drove to Owen's place. And I didn't text. I didn't call. I didn't explain. Here's what happened next, and I'm going to tell it to you plainly. She called me at 6:47 p.m. I remember because I was helping Owen make dinner, and I watched the phone buzz on the counter. I didn't answer. She called again at 6:52. I didn't answer. A text came through. Hey, are you on your way home? There's nothing to eat. I was thinking we could order something. Normal. Cheerful. No indication that she'd noticed anything yet. I put the phone face down. At 7:30, another text. You okay? You're usually home by now. At 8:15. Getting a little worried. Can you just let me know you're fine? At 9 o'clock. Please answer. I don't know what's going on. At 9:47. I went home and your stuff is gone. What is happening? Please call me. At 10:03. Is this some kind of joke? I don't understand. At 10:31. I'm scared. Please just tell me you're okay. At 11:14. Okay, I get it. You're clearly upset about something. But you need to talk to me. This is not okay. And then, at 11:52 p.m., the last one that night. I don't know what I did. Please. I didn't respond to any of them. That sounds cruel. I know it does. And I won't stand here and tell you I felt nothing reading those messages. I felt quite a lot. But what I kept coming back to was the word she'd used in that kitchen. Paranoid. She'd looked me in the eye, with her hand on my arm, and called what I was feeling paranoid. She'd had weeks to choose transparency. Weeks to close the gap that had opened between us. She'd chosen a post about privacy instead. She'd chosen a second phone tucked behind a charger cable. She'd chosen practice silence. So had I now. The difference was, she hadn't known mine was coming. The next morning brought a cascade. Missed calls. More texts. And then, at 8:22 a.m., a text that was different from the others. Not scared. Not confused. Angry. This is manipulative and immature. You left without saying a single word. What kind of person does that? I read it. I set the phone down. I made coffee. At 8:46, I deserve an explanation. We've been together 2 years. At 9:03, I know you're reading these. Read receipts are on. I turned read receipts off. At 9:34, fine. Don't talk to me. But you should know this says a lot about who you are. I drank my coffee. Owen came into the kitchen, looked at my face, poured himself a cup without asking any questions, and sat across from me. Bad night, he said. I've had worse, I said. We sat together in comfortable silence. And I was grateful, genuinely grateful, that some people in your life are just solid. Dependably, quietly solid. She reached out to Owen on the second day. He told me about it himself. She'd messaged him asking if he'd heard from me, if I was okay, if he knew what was going on. Owen told her I was fine. He didn't tell her where I was. She pushed a little, asked him to convince me to call her, said I wasn't being fair, said I was torturing her with the silence. Owen responded simply, I think he'll reach out when he's ready. She didn't reply after that. Cassie called me on day 3. I actually answered that one, because Cassie was the kind of person who didn't call unless she had something real to say. She's a mess, Cassie said, without preamble. Okay, I said. I'm not telling you that to guilt you, she added quickly. I just thought you should know. I appreciate that. A pause. Then Cassie said, she told me she doesn't know what she did wrong. And I didn't say anything for a moment. Because that sentence was genuinely interesting to me. Not hurtful. Interesting. She doesn't know what she did wrong. Truly? Or is that what she was saying? Cassie, I said, did she mention a second phone? The pause on the other end was about a second longer than it should have been. What? Cassie said. And her voice had changed. Not much. Just enough. Forget it, I said. No, what are you talking about? It's fine, I said. I appreciate you calling. I really do. Another pause. Okay, Cassie said slowly. And then, I think she might know exactly what she did. She didn't say anything else about that. Neither did I. On day 5, Amber stopped texting. Cold. Complete. The kind of silence that's louder than noise. And I understood it, because I'd done the same thing. When her anger hadn't worked, when her pain hadn't worked, when her confusion hadn't worked, she'd run out of strategies. And what's left when you've run out of strategies? Silence. And distance. And pride. Now I want to tell you about what I learned. Not from her. From someone who came to me about 10 days after I left. His name was Qley. I knew him vaguely. He was someone in Amber's wider social circle, the kind of person who shows up at group gatherings and is pleasant and forgettable. He messaged me on a platform I barely used, which I think was deliberate on his part. He knew I'd see it because I'd get a notification rather than it getting lost in the stack. He said, "Hey, I know this is random and I don't know if it's my place, but I've known Amber for a while and I thought you deserved to know something." I stared at that message for a long time. Then I said, "Go ahead." He said Marcus had been back in the picture for about 8 months. 8. Marcus, the old acquaintance, the background name, the person who didn't matter. Qley didn't know everything. He was clear about that. He said he'd seen them together twice in a context that hadn't felt platonic, and that he'd heard her on the phone with someone she was clearly being secretive about. He said he'd almost reached out before, but convinced himself it wasn't his business. He said he'd finally messaged because when word got around that I'd left without explanation, he felt like he'd waited too long. I thanked him. He said, "You seem like a decent person. I'm sorry." I closed the app, and I sat with the number 8. 8 months. For 8 months, I'd been living in an apartment with a woman who was managing a parallel reality. For 8 months, I'd been reading late nights and screen tilts and quiet distances as stress, or mood, or just the natural evolution of a long relationship. For 8 months, I'd been the person who wasn't supposed to ask questions. The person who was supposed to see the post about privacy and nod. The person who was paranoid. Let me tell you something about the word paranoid. In relationships, it gets used as a diagnostic, as a pathology. If you're suspicious, you're paranoid. If you're worried, you're insecure. If you notice patterns, you're controlling. And the thing about that language, that careful, clinical vocabulary, is that it puts the burden entirely on the person doing the noticing. It reframes the problem. It makes you the issue. So you stop noticing. You stop asking. You nod. And the person on the other side of that language keeps doing exactly what they were doing before, only now they have your cooperation. Now they have your silence. I think about that kitchen conversation a lot. Not with anger. With something closer to clarity. Because I understand now that the moment she called me paranoid was the moment she made her final choice. She could have met me there, in the kitchen, at the sink, with the soapy water and the cold truth, and chosen honesty. It would have been hard. It would have been an awful conversation. But it would have been real. She chose the other thing instead. And honestly, so did I eventually. Just not in the way she expected. About 3 weeks after I left, she sent one final message. Not frantic. Not angry. Measured. Like she drafted it several times. I've been doing a lot of thinking. I know I handled some things wrong. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. But what you did, disappearing without a word, that was cruel. I needed closure, and you didn't give it to me. I needed an explanation, and you gave me silence. I don't think that's fair, and I don't think you can feel good about it either. I hope you're okay. But I need you to know that what you did hurt me too. I read it 4 times. It was well written. It was, in its own way, kind of impressive, the framing, the restraint. She'd taken something she had done and carefully, surgically repositioned it so that we were now both equally guilty parties. She'd made my departure the story, my silence the injustice, my absence the wound worth examining. And somewhere in there, buried in the composed, considered language, was the implication that I owed her something. Closure. Explanation. Words. I sat with it for a day, and then I thought about her post. Privacy is important in relationships. You don't owe anyone access to every part of your life. Boundaries exist for a reason. She'd said it herself. She'd posted it publicly. She'd meant it for herself, obviously. She'd meant it as armor. But armor, by definition, works both ways. I didn't respond. I'm not going to tell you that the weeks and months that followed were easy. They weren't. The apartment logistics were complicated and took time. There were mutual friends who took sides, or tried not to, or asked questions I didn't feel like answering. There were nights at Owen's place where I lay awake and thought about the Sunday mornings and the trip plans and the birthday cards, and felt something heavy and quiet moving through me that I didn't have a clean word for. Not grief exactly. Not anger. More like the specific, strange sadness of realizing that a version of your life you thought was real was only partially so. that you'd been living in a house where one of the walls was painted backdrop, and you'd love the house anyway, and you'll love the next one too, eventually, the real one. That part one knew with certainty, but knowing something and feeling it aren't the same thing, and I gave myself time to just feel it without rushing. Owen was decent about it. He didn't push. He cooked on weekends and put basketball on the TV and occasionally said something useful and mostly just let me exist in the same space without demanding I be okay. That was enough. Here's the thing about removing yourself from someone's life without explanation. People will have opinions about it. Strong ones. The most common one I heard, from mutual friends, from Cassie, even gently from my own mother once she knew what had happened, was that I denied Amber the closure she needed. That no matter what she'd done, she deserved a conversation, a confrontation, a proper ending with words and tears, and the whole painful, necessary ritual of it. And I've thought about that argument carefully. I've given it real consideration. And here's where I land. Closure is a gift. It's something you give someone who has been honest with you. It's something you give someone who, when faced with the choice between truth and concealment, chose truth. It's something you give someone who, in the kitchen, at the sink, with the question hanging between you like smoke, chose to open a window instead of letting it thicken. Amber hadn't done that. She'd had months of windows. She'd kept them all closed. She bought a second phone and kept it charged and tucked away and let me stand in our shared apartment and call myself paranoid. I didn't know her the conversation she should have started. There is one more thing I want to tell you, and then I'm done. About 4 months after I left, I was at a coffee shop near my new place. I'd moved out of Owens by then, got a small apartment of my own, nothing remarkable, but mine, and I ran into Cassie. Just by chance. The random, absurd geography of a city that sometimes folds in on itself. She sat down with me for a while. We talked about normal things. And then she said, unprompted, "She's with him now." I didn't ask who she meant. I knew who she meant. I looked out the window for a second. Then I said, "Okay." Cassie watched me. "That's it," she said. "Just okay." "Just okay," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You knew, didn't you? Before you left. You knew." "I knew enough," I said. "Why didn't you say anything to her?" I thought about it. Not to perform consideration, I genuinely thought about it. And then I said, "Because she'd already told me everything I needed to know." Cassie looked at me. "The post," she said slowly. "Among other things," I said. She nodded. She picked up her coffee cup. She said, very quietly, almost to herself, "I thought that post was weird when she shared it." "Most people did," I said. "They just didn't say so." I think a lot about the mechanics of what happened. Not Amber specifically. Not Marcus. Not the second phone or the late nights or the post. The mechanics underneath all of it. The way people convince themselves that concealment is the same as privacy. That hiding is just a form of boundaries. That if you frame it the right way, if you find the right language, the right aesthetic quote on a black background, you can make secrecy feel like self-preservation. And the thing is, that works. It works on the person you're hiding from. It works because they love you and they want to believe you. And belief is always easier than doubt. And doubt is always exhausting. It works right up until the moment the person you've been managing finally stops managing their own discomfort. Right up until the moment they stop nodding. Right up until the moment they come home from a coffee shop with a friend and pack a quiet bag and lock a door behind them and drop a key in a slot. And then it stops working. And all the framing in the world doesn't matter anymore. Because you can't retroactively make something honest. You can't unbuild the architecture of a lie by explaining the blueprints. You just have to sit in the apartment with whatever's left. I'm in a different place now. Literally and figuratively. The new apartment has a window that faces east, which I didn't realize I cared about until I started waking up to it every morning. Natural light at 6 a.m. does something to you. I've been reading more. I've been running, which I hadn't done consistently since college. I've been paying attention to the things I was too distracted, too busy maintaining a story I'd half convinced myself was true, to notice before. I'm not telling you I'm healed or fixed, or that I look back at those 2 years as a waste. I don't. There were real things in them. Real mornings and real laughter and real care, or something close enough to care that the difference didn't matter in the moment. I don't regret any of that. I regret that I was slow. I regret the nod in the kitchen. I regret the amount of time I spent talking myself out of what I was seeing. But I don't regret the bag. I don't regret the key in the slot. I don't regret the silence that followed. Because sometimes the most honest thing you can do in a relationship built on dishonesty is to simply stop participating. No dramatics. No confrontation. No audience. Just a quiet, complete, total withdrawal. A removal. An honoring of the privacy she'd said was so important. She wanted the private spaces between us left alone. I left them all alone. I left all of it alone. Every single bit of it. Including her. She posted about privacy. She said you don't owe anyone access to every part of your life. She said boundaries exist for a reason. She was building a philosophy in real time, crafting the language that would justify what she was already doing. And the thing she didn't account for, the thing that never occurs to people when they're constructing those justifications, is that the logic runs in every direction. If you don't owe me access to every part of your life, I don't owe you access to mine. Not even the part where I decide it's over. Not even the part where I pack a bag. Not even the part where I'm done. She posted about privacy. I honored it. Completely. Permanently. And I never looked back. Some walls are built to keep people out. Others are built so the person inside can pretend they're not. Either way, eventually, someone walks away from the wall and stops looking at it.